Good evening. We welcome you to our Glenview and Maplehurst Public School boundary study. We're excited tonight to share the findings and the work that our planning department and our parent representatives from Glenview and Maplehurst have gathered together their thinking to present to you this evening as the viewers. While we will not be having you raise your hand to take questions, as this is a live stream, there is a form that you can present your questions during this presentation, and we will be happy to answer those. If we are unable to answer those questions in the time permitted this evening, we will definitely ask you to encourage to fill out the form for the survey of your feedback and present questions there, where we will continue to update this presentation on our website following our live stream this evening. At this point, I'd like to turn it over to my fellow superintendent, Nick Frankovich, to acknowledge the land.
Halton, as we know it today, is rich in history and modern traditions of many First Nations and the Métis. From the Anishinaabe to the Attawandaron, the Haudenosaunee, and the Métis, these lands surrounding the Great Lakes are steeped in Indigenous history. As we gather today on these treaty lands, we have the responsibility to honor and respect the four directions: land, waters, plants, animals, ancestors that walked before us, and all the wonderful elements of creation that exist. We would like to acknowledge and thank the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation for sharing their traditional territory with us. At this time, I'd like to invite Director Ennis to bring a greeting to our group.
Thank you so much, Nick, and good evening, everyone. It is so good to be with you here at the Glenview Maplehurst boundary study. I know that boundary studies can be anxiety producing for some folks, and I know that there are lots of expectations. I want to just take this opportunity before we go any further to thank our Board of Trustees, and in particular, we want to thank Trustees Daniele and Trustee Diodati for their service to this boundary study. Also like to thank Superintendent Newton and Superintendent Frankovich for the great work that they have been doing in the area. I also want to acknowledge and thank our parents, because without them, we certainly wouldn't have the kinds of outcomes that we're looking for and the kinds of voices that we honor. We want to thank you, Christine, Elma, Tim, and Kendra, for the great work that you have done and for all the contributions you have made and will be making to this study. We know that we're looking to get your feedback, we're looking to get your insights, and we know that this is often challenging as we look at the various options that are going to be presented to us. We know that just through human nature and through our circumstances that we all have, it's very complex, and it's perhaps not possible to get an option that fits everyone's need, but we're hoping to find an outcome that will be supported by the vast majority within this area. And so we're looking for your ideas and your solutions to lead us to that best solution. And just want to say thanks to General Manager Thibault and his team for the great work they have done in putting this together. And we look forward to an evening of collaboration and cooperation where we work in a respectful manner that honors the voices of everyone. And so we're looking forward to a wonderful evening, and just want to turn it back over to staff. So thank you so much and have a wonderful evening.
Thank you very much, Director Ennis. At this time, I would welcome my co-chair on this committee, Donna Dinelli.
Thank you very much. And I know you'll be hearing from my colleague and your trustee, Matthew Diodati, later in the program. But I just wanted to say thank you so much. It's been my honor and my privilege to be able to serve on this committee and to learn so much about your community from the input we've received and from the community members. You have been incredibly welcome and generous in sharing your input and your feedback. And I wanted to express my thanks. And I'm looking forward to tonight's meeting and learning even more about working towards the best solution for your community and your schools. Thank you.
Thank you very much to both Matthew and Donna for helping in this process to date. At this time, I'd like to introduce Fred Thibault, who heads up our planning department, who will run through the agenda and present the options that we have explored to date.
Thanks, Jackie, and thanks, everyone. So again, my name's Frederick Thibault, General Manager of Planning at the Halton District School Board, and I'm joined here with my team as well, which will be assisting throughout the process. But with that said, our meeting for this evening is divided up into three separate parts. Our first part is going to be where staff as well as members of the BRC will give you somewhat of an overview of the boundary review process, the role of our boundary review committee, as well as introduce two of our parent members. Then we'll proceed in providing a presentation of the shortlisted options that have been curated and selected by our boundary review committee to present tonight at this evening's public information session. Afterwards, what we'll do is we'll hand it over to, I guess, the public for an opportunity to provide questions and feedback. Just to note that we had opened the question forum a little bit earlier last week, just to allow some questions to start coming in. So what we'll do is we'll start addressing those questions first and foremost, and you are free to submit more questions as the evening goes on. Just for the sake of time, what we're doing is we'll limit it for this evening at least to one question per email moving forward, and just so that we can get to everyone. Also to note that any questions that we are responding to, you may not hear it in the same verbiage as you've submitted. That's probably because we're combining a lot of the same questions together so that we can get through as many of the inquiries as possible. Following that, we'll probably stop in and around closer to the 8:20 mark, at which point what I'd like to do is just provide a little bit more insight as to what the next steps of this process are going to be. And then we'll hand it off to Trustee Diodati just to provide a final word and thank you to all the attendees as well as the members of the committee. So without further delay, we're just going to go through the purpose and objective of this boundary review. So as many of you may know or are here to learn more about tonight is the background surrounding this is on December 7th, there was a board motion that was approved by our board of trustees to commence this boundary review process. And it was resolved that the Halton District School Board directs staff to complete a boundary review for ERA 100, the Aldershot area, with the objective of addressing accommodation pressures. So more specifically, what that means is the major purpose of this boundary review was to attenuate some of the growth pressures that were being witnessed at Glenview Public School. And as we'll go through the existing enrollment projections for that school, what you'll note is that we were reaching a point where we were going to surpass its maximum capacity, and we had to alleviate some of those pressures and try to balance out enrollment so that we're not maxing out our portables on site. And given the rate of growth that we've seen more recently, we need to implement this for September 2023 to avoid reaching that maximum capacity. So with that, as part of the process, and I'll get into that in a few with our boundary review steering committee, is we defined a study area as to what the impacted schools would be. And for this particular review, what we're looking at doing is including both Maplehurst and Glenview public schools. Both are K-6 facilities. In terms of overall utilization at the present time, Glenview was the school that had a lot more pressures, currently operating at 122% as of October 31st of 2021 and projected to increase over time. Whereas Maplehurst was currently at 65% of its overall utilization. So what that means is that of the total number of spaces available at a facility, built spaces, not inclusive of portables, there were that many more students that was available in that space requiring portables, or that fewer number of students to fill up the entire facility. In terms of programs, the purpose of this review was strictly to review the English language boundaries. Do note, however, Maplehurst does have the French immersion program as well as a special education program, both of which we weren't part of this review. So among other things, what we're seeing in Aldershot specifically is a combination of both an increase in overall enrollment in the more established urban areas that are already built out. What we're seeing is a lot more neighborhood regeneration, especially after we saw somewhat of a boom pre and just during COVID, as we saw a huge influx of individuals moving into the area west. So a lot of the GTA population moving further west into larger homes or upsizing or moving into more family conducive units. In concert with that, what we're also seeing, there's a lot of growth designated within the Aldershot area. So right now there's three major areas of growth. One is some of the intensification that's happening along Plains Road, which is starting to contribute to overall growth within the area. There is the major transit station area that's been designated by both the province and by the city of Burlington, which is going to be an area of intensification with high density growth. And we're already seeing some of that come in as of now, and we'll continue to see it over the next few years. And then we have the North Aldershot planning area, which has a number of units planned for it, but given certain infrastructure limitations, we haven't seen a lot of momentum on that, and we don't expect to in the near future. So with that, I don't want to go into too great of a detail, but as you can probably tell by this, is that there's a significant number of development units that are planned and projected within this area over the next 10 to 15 years. And a lot of it right now is being allocated to Glenview's catchment area. Maplehurst does have some growth assigned to it, but there's certainly an opportunity here to rebalance that, just to make sure that Glenview doesn't have too much pressure. But there's also the fact, as I mentioned earlier, that we have to rebalance a little bit of that existing community where we are seeing an overall increase in enrollment. In terms of where we're at in the process right now, we started this process early on in January. We've had a number of meetings with our boundary review steering committee. We had our inaugural one in December, where essentially what we did at that meeting was establish which schools would be impacted, as well as identify what process we'd be going through, either a community consultation process, which we're going through now, or one to inform the community. But as you can tell, we're here tonight with a full-blown public consultation process with the boundary review committee. Throughout those meetings, we've reached tonight's consultation meeting, and this will be followed by one final boundary review and steering committee meeting later in February, and then afterwards we'll be going to board with this in March for first consideration and on March 1st and final approval on March 22nd. I'll get into more details on this at the later part of the presentation once we get into next steps. In terms of our communications platform that we use to inform communities with regards to this, not only with the commencement of the boundary review, but any updates that are to come in final decisions, we've got three main pillars. One is through our standalone webpage for this boundary review that you can access on the board website, or if you Google Glenview Maplehurst boundary review, this will pop up. We also have a dedicated email that the board established, so that's where all the inquiries that you have or things to consider as we're going through the process that we want to share with our boundary review committee were sent to. And then we had our school messenger communications. So as I mentioned earlier, if there's any notifications that we want to send out to our communities, or if you want to know what's going to be happening in the coming months with the process, look out for those school messenger emails, as that's where you're going to get updates on what's happening with this boundary review process and where we're ultimately going to land. So at this time, I just want to give an introduction to our boundary review committee. As Jackie and Chris had mentioned earlier, and thank for their presence, we have 4 school representatives. We had 2 from Glenview and 2 from Maplehurst. And we'll have some of those reps speak to us tonight about the process and their thoughts on the overall, or where we've gone so far. In terms of the chairs, we had Trustee Donna Danielli as co-chaired with Jackie Newton. The trustee for the affected area is Matthew Diodati, and then the family school superintendent of the affected area was Nick Frankovich. And the planning department, we're joined here tonight with Michelle Dagwar, the senior analyst for this area, Mitchell Gundy, and Lorraine Choi, which is helping us out tonight. And lastly, we also had a member of the Halton Student Transportation Services join us too, because there was a lot of questions with regards to transportation and eligibility for busing, and that is Andrew Capron. The Boundary Review Committee has a pretty important role and a very important mandate in terms of what they're responsible in achieving throughout this process. And at its core, what the committee is looking to do is represent all students and look to everyone, not just their respective school areas, and look at this holistically as objectively as possible. And the objective is really to work collaboratively so they can provide feedback and insights, especially on the ground information on what's happening in their community, so we can modify some of the initial options we're going through, ask for new options, and work through the process. Eventually, the goal and objective is to come up with a or a few options that they would like to recommend and bring forward for consideration by the Boundary Review Steering Committee, which those are then presented to the Director of Education and senior team to consider bring forward to the Board of Trustees for final approval. As I mentioned earlier, we typically have 2 representatives from each affected school communities. So for Glenview, we had Tim Rye and Christine Sawchuk, and for Maplehurst, we had Elma Forte and Kendra Murphy. So again, I'll extend my thanks for all the hard work you've done at this point. And these members were selected and appointed by their school council reps or in collaboration with them. So with that, I'd like to just take a moment and I'll pass it over to Christine and Elma just to give us their perspective on this process and where we've landed thus far.
Thanks, Fred. Speaking on behalf of Tim and myself, we volunteered for this because we first and foremost care about our school community and the larger Aldershot community. We've seen the growth in the area and we wanted to bring an objective and thoughtful mindset to the process. So at a high level, as parent reps, our job was to listen to parent input and comments and come up with options that create a sustainable solution for the entire community, because this is a community issue that needs to be solved. Director Ennis mentioned this earlier, but one of the first things we discussed in the process that we will never come up with an option that perfectly aligns with each of the 8 criteria aligned by the board. And similarly, for each zone, there are arguments that can be made for why that zone should stay with Glenview or move to Maplehurst. And, you know, as we went through this process, we realized that there were no easy answers. I think that's why we're here today. And that's why we went from 3 to essentially 13 options over the past month. So at the first meeting in January, the board ensured that the parent reps were on the same page in terms of how to read the option sheets and capacity charts and the concept of building and functional capacity and how that impacts portable requirements. So we were very well versed in the needs and what the actual issues were. And at that meeting and subsequent to that meeting, we also talked to the board about how the projections were developed. So where they got their information from. Are the projections conservative? Are they aggressive? From our input or from our observations, that the board developed realistic projections, and they were based on consultation with the city and developers. So while we didn't audit the projections prepared by the board, we certainly did ask a lot of questions about the calculations and the assumptions. And the board answered all of our questions openly, and we did not have any reason to believe that the projections were not reasonable. So moving past that, calculation matter, most of the parents' reps' time has been spent on assessing the options against each of the 8 criteria provided to the board. And that was something we've revisited multiple times, probably each day over the past month. Again, we started the process acknowledging that no one option would perfectly address all the criteria. But the one common comment that we heard from parents was, let's try to minimize disruption to students in recognition of the potential impact of the process on their mental health. So it's that student experience criteria on the criteria list. And then as the parent reps talked about this some more, we thought, the only way we could actually do this in an objective way using the data available was to say, okay, how can we minimize the number of students moving? But in considering that, we also had to ensure that we were setting, the community up for success for the next 6 or 7 or 8 years. We wanted to make sure that we didn't have another situation like this in a couple years where there was another boundary review happening. So how do we create a sustainable situation for the community? So layered on top of that is all the other criteria that we considered. So we did talk a lot about walkability and balance of enrollments. We talked about balance of enrollments in terms of how it impacts overall capacity and the necessity of portables. We also talked about how the balance of enrollments impacts access to school resources. So, how often is your child able to go to the library with their class, and are they using the gym? Can the school community actually celebrate events together at the school? And I'll let Alma talk about this when she speaks, but we did consider their criteria from both schools, but the discussion was obviously weighted more heavily towards Glenview, as Glenview students would be the students moving. We started off with 3 options during the first meeting, and then we came up with 10 additional options over the course of the month. And those options were based on input gathered before and after the meetings from the parent community, and as well as issues that were clarified by the board at the meetings. So I think the last thing I wanted to address, because it's something that we've received a lot of comments on, was how was the parent input and feedback actually considered and acknowledged into the process. So all of the feedback, all of the comments that we received were reviewed and acknowledged and considered. And so those 10 additional options that were developed were based on parent feedback and comments and tenable suggestions for options. So when we did receive, reasonable solutions that would create a sustainable future for the community for the next few years, we really did appreciate it. So thank you to everyone, involved who provided detailed feedback with those comments. The parent reps have spent a lot of time on our own and in a small group discussing and analyzing, dissecting all the feedback and options. So the time spent in these public meetings where you're seeing us talking is just really the tip of the iceberg. There's many, many hours that have gone on behind the scenes. And if you're wondering why comments or questions or feedback wasn't explicitly brought up at the meetings, it's because that information that you've provided in your emails has already been discussed and analyzed by the reps and the board, and that's what we use to develop the new options. I think that the questions that we've asked in meetings have really focused on getting clarity as to the impact of certain options. So just to clarify, just because your specific question or comment wasn't addressed verbatim, it doesn't mean that we've ignored it, because we haven't. Everything was considered when we talked about the options to develop. And finally, the board's been great with running the options, or running the numbers on the options that we've asked them to run, and answering our questions. Again, we have 8 criteria that we're trying to assess each option against. And while we couldn't prioritize any, one criteria over another, we had comfort that, the student's experience was first and foremost one of the, if not the most important criteria that we were measuring the options against. Thanks, Fred.
Thanks for that, Christine. It's very much appreciated, and thanks for providing that insight to our community members to let them know a little bit on all the hard work you guys have been doing over the last month. I know it's a lot of work to look at. There's a lot of numbers, a lot of considerations, a lot of moving parts, and we definitely acknowledge that it was expertly managed and navigated on your end. So again, I want to extend my thanks on that front. All right. Moving forward. All right, so this is where we're getting into these option criteria that Christina was mentioning earlier. So I'll spend a little bit of time on this this evening, and then we'll dive right into our options that we've looked, or the shortlisted one, as well as the current situation that we're facing. But of the 8 options, here we go. Or 8 criteria, here we go. We have the viability of the program. So this one is something that we look at in terms of whatever boundary we're designated and the number of students that are within that boundary. Are we creating a situation where there's either too many students or not enough students, where we're looking at triple splits and things of that nature? So we have multiple grades in one classroom, so 3 or more. And in this case, where we're not as impacted, so we do have some healthy development overall. Healthy enrollment. So this one was one that was, I'd say, easily attained. Proximity to school. So our big thing at this board is that we do want to promote active transportation, walking to school, as well as sustainable transportation. Busing is the other alternative, but where we can, we want to make sure that there's a safe walking opportunity for all students to get to and from school. So really, that's where we're prioritizing that neighborhood model, understanding what the surrounding neighborhood immediately adjacent to that school looks like versus other surrounding areas, and how they're connected, and try to encourage that walkability as much as we can. Third is stable long-term boundaries. Albeit our administrative procedure says that we shouldn't be affecting students more than once every 5 years, as we're doing boundary reviews is the target. We hope that it's more than that. Sometimes we're limited and we can't, but we're always striving so that we're reducing that impact, because we do acknowledge that this is a change and it is a disruption, and that where we can reduce that, and especially in the short term, all the better. And if we can push that to a medium to long term, that's even more optimal. And this is what we're really trying to achieve and balance throughout this process, is how can we push this as far out as possible. In terms of balancing enrollment, what we're looking to do is ensure that we don't have certain facilities that are significantly overutilized and are feeling pressures. As Christina mentioned earlier, we don't want to have situations where kids can't get to their gymnasium, or they're overgrown in their school facility because of a significant amount of pressure. And on the other side of the coin, we also don't want to have schools that are significantly underutilized, where because of a smaller student population, they don't have as much staffing resources, or they have a lot of empty space, and maybe they don't have as many opportunities overall. So really, it's about how do we balance the two so that they're well utilized and that they have a good sustainable population. Portables and porta packs, we're trying to minimize that as much as we can. Portables are a reality in Halton. There's something that we see throughout the region, especially given the growth, which growth is a good thing. It means that we're not declining enrollment. However, we do want to minimize them where we can, and we want to use the interior school space where it's available, because unfortunately with portables, and especially with smaller sites like we see in Aldershot, portables does have an impact on the overall site. So if we can find ways to minimize how much site we're consuming, all the better. Transportation wise, is we're trying to minimize where possible the need for busing and transportation. If there's opportunities to increase or better walkability and ensure that that's a priority that's given, then we reduce our transportation. Or if transportation is needed, make sure that it's done in an efficient way so that we're maintaining our resources in the classroom as opposed to in the bus or in portables or things like that, which ties into fiscal responsibility, which is, if we're creating these options, let's make sure that the options are something that's fiscally sustainable. So again, the resources we're putting into it is not in the portable or transportation or things like that. It's in the classroom. Albeit, like I said, sometimes there's a reality where portables and transportation is going to be required. Nonetheless, we try to minimize it where possible. And last, but certainly not least, as was mentioned earlier, one of the most important factors, and one that's been strongly considered in all the options we've reviewed, as part of this process, it's the student experience. And, it ties also to stable long-term boundaries. Are we creating something that is going to be sustainable over the long term? Are we minimizing the amount of impacts to students, the amount of moves that are anticipated? And the other piece of this is, as we finalize this, is how do we move into the transition and make sure that we're finding ways to keep, some stability for these students as well. Oh, before I move on, maybe one other thing, and Christine had already mentioned this, but in all the options we reviewed, there's not one that will meet all of these perfectly. They will all achieve these different criteria in different ways. And really the role of the boundary review committee is to find ways to, how do we balance all of these together? And the sum of its part is what makes an option rise above the rest in terms of the overall achievement of each one of these, and also the ones that we prioritize as a committee. Now, before we get into the options, I just want to, like we did with our boundary review committee, just to explain to you how we're going to present the options tonight. So one of the first things that we've done as part of this process is we create zones throughout the study area. So that way we can look at these geographic areas and use those to see what pieces we move together in order to create new boundaries. Each one of these zones have a specific enrollment projection tied to the existing community and how many students we anticipate over the long term based on actual students. And these are the moving parts that we put together in terms of developing our boundaries. At the onset, we had a total of 11 zones that were identified, and we've along the way created 2 subzones. So that's zones EB, where we divided zone E, and zone HB, where we divided zone H, and a couple of the options that were reviewed. When we create these zones, what we try to do is have regard for the neighborhood fabric. So as an example, as you're walking through that neighborhood, you don't really see a break. You can see that it's contiguous and it's continuous. Whereas if you're having to cross maybe a major river or a geographic feature, a roadway, an arterial, or things like that, that's where we try to divide the zones. Or if we're looking at little pockets and we're trying to divvy up in such a way where we can find different options. So we're always trying to keep those areas together where they're defined by geographic features or significant features altogether. Secondly, we'll be demonstrating enrollment projections through charts this evening. So I'll go through how to read the charts overall rather quickly. But this is what we're looking at in terms of how do we assess how successful a certain option is in terms of meeting the balance of enrollment and not getting in a situation where we're surpassing the max capacity, which in this case, what we're showing with these 2 lines is the bottom line is the on-the-ground capacity, so the OTG. And what that represents is the built capacity of the facility. What was that facility built for? How many students can we fit in it? In the physical building itself, the permanent building. The second line represented in red is the max capacity. So that's taking a capacity of the total max number of portables permitted on site based on a number of factors and adding that to the overall capacity. And the idea here is that if you surpass the red line, then we're in a problem. Or if you're near the red line, you run into some issues in terms of surpassing that max capacity when then we can't accommodate our students on site. The second one is portable counts. So here it aligns with each year of the enrollment projection. And what we're representing here is how many portables we anticipate to be needed on site based on the overall enrollment projection and based on a staffing projection for this on how many sections in a school will be required and therefore how many classrooms and so forth. In this case, if we ever see a blank number, that means that no portables are required on site. Green means that the number of portables is 75% less than the total number of max portables available on site. So in this case here, the max number of portables is 6, 3 is 50%, we're in the green. 5 here represented orange represents when we're getting the caution area, where it means we're getting close to that max capacity. And in this case, we're beyond that 75%. And red represents anything above that max capacity. So if we have a red number, that means we're going to have some kind of initiative or solution to that problem. Is it another boundary change? Is it addition? Is it the creation of more classrooms? Those are all options that we'd have to look at to address that issue, or it may be an indicator that it's not feasible. Lastly, we have our overall enrollment projections. So these are representing the bars here as well as the numerical values for each. And this is where we're looking to gauge how well are we doing with that max capacity, also with the number of max portables on site. And throughout this, we're trying to find, okay, at what point do we reach max capacity, and is this a feasible solution overall? So this is certainly something we spent a lot of time reviewing in each of the options to see at what point do we run into issues and what would be the solution at that point. How sustainable is this? So with that, we're going to start with our options review, beginning with the current programs and boundaries. So as I mentioned earlier, the boundaries right now that we're looking at are strictly the English program boundaries. The French immersion program boundaries are remaining they're remaining untouched. And that reason is that the French immersion boundary encompasses the entirety of the English boundary. So any movement, whatever it is, between Glenview and Maplehurst, they're going to go to Maplehurst for the French immersion program regardless. In terms of a little bit of an overall accommodation to highlight on both facilities, Maplehurst right now has a total enrollment of about 337 students. Its max capacity, or its building capacity, is 519 with a max capacity of 634. At this point, we can only fit 5 portables on site. Alternatively, we have Glenview, which has a current enrollment of 448 students and a built capacity of 504 with a little bit of a typo there. So yeah, the max capacity is 504 with maximum portables of 6. So right now we're at 122% utilization. In terms of transportation boundary, when the transportation eligibility boundary, which also coincides with what we define as the walking boundary, where we expect students to walk, or is defined by 1.6 kilometer distance. And the way that we calculate that distance isn't as the crow flies. It's based on a route network. So from the outer edge of the school property all the way to the outer edge of someone else's home property, that's the distance we measure. And anybody that falls within 1.6 kilometers is designated as a walker or not eligible for transportation. And anybody beyond that is eligible for transportation. Sometimes that 1.6 kilometer, although you may surpass it, or sometimes that 1.6 kilometer is cut off in certain areas because there's a physical boundary that prevents a certain crossing. So if there's someone that has to cross a major arterial and there's no safe crossing, then we would create an exemption area for that. And in this case here, although Plains Road can be seen as one of those barriers because we have a signalized crossing as well as a crossing guard, that makes that area available for transportation. So overall, Glenview has a pretty good walking boundary, given the fact that we do have that coverage across Plains Road. And south of Plains Road, you have really good coverage, and that you have that neighborhood fabric with all the contiguous streets that connect and essentially come into a central point, which is Glenview. Maplehurst in itself is a little bit more reliant on transportation. as there's not as much population to the north. So most of its area south of the south of the 403 is walkable. Overall, right now, we have a number of buses. So both between Glenview and Maplehurst, we have just about 500 students that are currently being transported. And those are anybody that's outside of these areas that are designated here. In terms of our enrollment projections, I'm going to start with Glenview. And this is where we're running into issues almost immediately. Is as of this year, we've already achieved about 5 portables on site with a max portable count of 6. And what we're projecting is that by next year, we're going to reach 7 portables. So we're going to reach that maximum capacity, which leads into an issue and is kind of the driver behind this entire boundary review. And this is projected to continue on over the long term. So here is where we're looking to rebalance this overall. Alternatively, when you look at Maplehurst, it's not anticipated to have any portables on site. It will probably remain within about 65% utilization over the long term. So it's here where we have an opportunity to take away the pressures from Glenview and send some of those kids over to Maplehurst in order to balance that and hopefully avoid boundary reviews for the long term. So starting with our first shortlisted option for this evening, we have option 3. As I narrate this, I'll be explaining what zones are going to be moving to which school. So for option 3, what we're looking to do here is we are relocating zones A, B, and E from Glenview over to Maplehurst. In this option here, as we're going to be looking through the numbers, what we're anticipating is the kindergarten to grade 5 students of this year would be moving, and any student that, the students from K to 5 will be moving for next year, and any student that's currently attending grade 5 will be given a legacy exemption or grandparented at their existing school. In this scenario here, we're looking at about 75 students that would be redirected to Maplehurst. In terms of the overall transported boundary, everything south of Plains Road at Glenview remains unchanged. North of Plains Road, what we see is a little bit of a reduction in the walk area, and that's because of this area here having a slightly larger walking distance to Maplehurst than it would to Glenview. So we're losing just under 10 walkers in this scenario, but overall, in terms of transportation, there's a very minimal impact. So whether they go to Glenview or Maplehurst, because there's a lot of bus sharing in this area, it remains relatively unchanged. In terms of enrollment projections, we're moving from 5 portables and we're declining to 3 within a 2-year time period. And those 3 portables are anticipated to remain on site for the long term. And the school is going to be over 100% utilization, but overall in a sustainable level. For Maplehurst, over the first few years, we're not going to see a lot of pressure coming in, but as development ramps up and we start seeing more students being generated by development, then that's where we're going to see that increase in population happen. So where we run into a little bit of an issue here is in 2030, when we exceed the max portable of 5 by having 7 portables required overall. So what this means is that by 2030, we'll have to look at an alternative solution to how we're going to be accommodating these students, whether it's a boundary review, whether it's perhaps a submission to the ministry for an addition. But again, it's all dependent, and we'll have to continue monitoring it until that time. And this will be a constant theme you see throughout the options, is that at a certain point in time, we're exceeding overall capacity within the area, and we're going to have some sort of solution within that 6 to 8 year time period. Moving on to option 10. In this option here, what we're doing is we're relocating zones A, B, F, and a portion of zone E, which we'll zoom into it for a second after the slide. And those zones are going to be redesignated to Maplehurst. And in this option, we're looking to move approximately 80 students overall. In terms of how we divide Zone E, which is something that a lot of the community, as well as their boundary committee members, had expressed some interest in exploring different ways on how we can divide this area between the established community and the development that's anticipated. What we did here is for the vast majority of it, we moved the vast majority of development that was within Zone E to Maplehurst and Zone EB, albeit there's still some development planned within that area. They would remain at Glenview. This does include a certain portion. So there is a townhouse development here that is built and does have existing students. So those students would be moved as well. And the rest here is designated for intensification as part of the Aldershot MTSA that we discussed earlier. In terms of transported boundaries here, we don't really see any changes. We based the division of Zone E on the walk boundary. So here, there's no impact to transportation overall. There might just be there's no impact to transportation or very minimal. With regards to the enrollment projections, what we're seeing here is a pretty significant drop from 5 portables down to 2. And then we'll see some fluctuations over the next 5 to 6 years, requiring between 2 to 4 portables. It's around 2029 to 2032 where we don't go beyond max, but we're right at the cusp. So in this situation here, we're just going to have to monitor very closely that we don't surpass it at that point in time. In comparison, looking at Maplehurst's overall enrollment projections, for the majority of the first few years, the utilization will be over 85%. And it's not until about 2030 where we're at max capacity. So we're just going to, again, have to monitor, make sure we're not going to go beyond it. And it's by 2031, we're going to get to 7 portables, which is above and beyond the maximum capacity of the school. So here we're really pushing out any concerns as far down the road, but we'll just have to do a lot of monitoring for Glenview, especially in those later years, to make sure it doesn't surpass that max portable capacity. And the last shortlisted option is option 11. In this scenario here, we relocated zones A, B, C, D, and a portion of E. So this is a different division of Zone E to Maplehurst. And in this option here, we're moving approximately 90 students. In terms of the overall division here, it's a little bit different than what we viewed earlier. So here we'd be maintaining some of the development at Glenview, and we'd be redesignating some of the other development on the other side of Cook Boulevard towards Maplehurst. So here what we're doing is we're dividing the overall enrollment pressures that are anticipated between 2 schools. In terms of transported boundaries, again, very similar to what we looked at in option 3 and then option 10. Glenview is primarily being maintained as its overall walk boundary. And in terms of overall impacts of transportation, it's quite minimal overall. Projection-wise for Glenview Public School, we're seeing a sharp decline in portable needs over the first few years, going from 5 to 2 to 3. And then long-term, it peaks out at 4 and then goes back to 3. So here we'll probably be at 4 portables in the later part of the projection. Alternatively, for Maplehurst, we don't have many portables no portables in the first few years, remaining above 85% utilization, which is a good target to be in. And it's not till 2030 where we exceed the max capacity by having 6 portables on site. So that, again, at this point, we'd have to find a solution to address this pressure. With that, we're moving on to the open question and answer period. So what we're going to do here is I'm going to hand it back over to our chair, Jackie Newton, and she will be providing us with questions that the Boundary Review Steering Committee will be answering. And again, many of these questions were received prior to the meeting. And so we'll answer those first, and they were categorized and grouped together based on common themes. And then any new ones that were received tonight, if they're new questions, then we'll add them at the end, and we'll continue on with that. So with that, I'll hand it over to Jackie.
Thank you very much, Fred. I know that's a lot of information for everybody to digest. At this time, for people, we'd also like to introduce Alma Forto. She's a parent for Maplehurst, and we would love to hear her perspective on the research that's both been presented tonight, but her journey on this team as well. Thank you, Alma.
Thank you, Jacqueline. I'm Alma Forto. I'm a parent of a child at Maplehurst. Thanks for introducing me, allowing me to represent the Maplehurst school community. I'm, like I mentioned, a parent of a child at Maplehurst in grade 2. I have the privilege of having a child attend a school that has engaged and committed educators. The voice of Maplehurst here is really to come to the table to see how we can work with the partners in our community to address their overpopulation issues at Glenview. I have the privilege over the last 4 years to have a child attend a school with less than 65% occupancy. So what that means for us is that he's always been in class sizes that have been quite small, and there are no portables at Maplehurst. So that in itself is a very unique situation within the region of Halton. What I've learned as part of this entire process is that it's an incredibly methodical and detailed process to actually go through and assess and evaluate school boundary reviews. There's lots of layers that both Fred has talked about and Christine, and thought that goes into assessing both from a regional and municipal level, population growth, expansion, elements around transportation and walkability. The 8 criteria that have been presented to you is something that we, as parents that were part of the committee and review process, continuously pointed to. And what I would very easily say is that as we went through the process, the voice of the student experience was always at the center. So although there are 8 criteria, I think I can comfortably say that the school board and the parents that were on the committee always had that rated as the highest priority. It really will depend where you fall in the 2 communities of schools on what you find to be of higher priority, or if you're just a general outsider in the community and looking at it from a taxpayer's perspective and that lens, you could rate any one of the 8 criteria in a different order of priority. But what I will really say, and I hope that the parents that are out there listening, both on the Maplehurst side and in the Glenview community, is that the voice of the student experience was always at the center. And we really looked at what were the best of the 13 options that we spent countless hours reviewing and poring over, would result in the best experience for our children and the schools that they will attend. So I just wanted to thank everybody for allowing me to be part of the process. And I'll hand it back to Fred.
Thank you so much, Alma. Really appreciate your insights on that. As you can see on our screen tonight for live streaming, you can send your questions in on the virtual form, and we will keep those rolling as the night goes. We're going to allow about a half an hour of questions, so please keep them coming in, and we will try to formulate those together. We also will review again following tonight's presentation that you can go back and put your feedback in regarding the options that you see this evening. So at this time, we'll start with question number 1 that was sent in earlier this week. And I will direct this to Fred, please. How will the Halton Board and the YMCA guarantee before and after care for students being moved to Maplehurst? Fred?
Thanks, Jackie. And Alma, my apologies. Thank you for that too. So
No problem, Fred.
thanks, Alma. My bad. So with regards to before and after care, so what we've done already is we've advised the YMCA that there is a boundary review that's currently being undertaken. So that way they're well aware of what the potential impacts are going to be as part of this and the potential student movement. So we've given them some general numbers as to what we're expecting on some of the shortlisted options. So a little bit of a range. And what they'll be doing is they'll be looking at doing a survey as to which parents, currently are reliant on the before and after care and a better understanding where they're located and if they're going to be impacted by this. So right now they're going to get back to us on next week and give us a little bit more details on that. So that's certainly something we could share, especially at the upcoming boundary meetings that are happening both with our BRC and at the board table. And they're going to try to figure out how to best balance out the needs between both communities with the YMCA.
Thank you, Fred. I'd like to move the conversation now to the purpose of a boundary review. So in doing boundary reviews, what is the ultimate goal of a boundary review? And would it make sense to move the least number of students or to move the most number of students?
So with that, it all depends. To me, it's finding a balance between the two. If you have to be able to move the number of students, an adequate number of students, so that you're creating a situation where you're addressing the main issue that you identified at the start of the process. And in this one, the main issue we've identified is that Glenview is seeing a significant amount of pressure, and a lot of it's generated from both existing community and growth that's coming, through new development. So in this one particularly, I think there was an opportunity to balance the two and looking at it long term, and saying, okay, well, how can we achieve what we're looking to do while minimizing the impacts to our existing school communities, and seeing if we can maybe rely more on development and balancing the two. So, I don't think it's a simple way of saying, like, can you just minimize it to almost none? I think you have to find a middle ground. Moreover, and this is something too we want to talk about with student experience. It's not just about the initial impact of moving students to another school. I think what's important to note too is that we're moving enough students so that when you're moving that overall cohort, you're not just moving a small portion of students that may not have a familiar face to move to this new facility with or to a new school with. You're moving a larger area so that there are common friendships or people in the same area, so that they're not feeling alone or left out, or just a specific area. So it's really a matter of balancing all of those elements together and making sure that at the end of the day we're addressing the key issue in this case, which is significant pressures at Glenview, while also making sure we're not having to do this within the next 5-year period.
Okay, thank you very much, Fred. And I know your experience in boundary reviews goes beyond the Burlington borders, but into other municipalities as well, and the work you do with your team to make sure that people feel respected in making these decisions. So thank you for that. We also know that one of the main criteria in the committee's work is to look at families, and in drawing borders and drawing grade differences and entry points. How will we try to ensure that families will not be divided from one going to one school and one attending another?
So with allowing siblings to stay together, I guess is okay. I think with this one, that's something that we'll have to review at the next meeting as to what we're looking at for implementation, and whether that's something we want to put on the table. We're already looking at some legacy exemptions for the most senior grades. So this year's grade 5 is moving into grade 6. One of the concerns we often had is when we extend with all the siblings is that depending where that sibling is within the overall process or the overall grade cohort, they may be staying at a school that maybe their neighbors and their friends are not necessarily attending. So I think it's there's a number of iterations of that it's sometimes a concern we have, or something that we don't always consider providing that legacy exemption or extending it to the siblings. So for that, I'd say most often than not, we prioritize the senior grade with legacy exemptions, and siblings will go to the other school unless there's extraneous situations. But for the most part, that's the approach we take.
Okay, and thank you, Fred. And we all know family is important, so we understand that indeed. I'd like to change the conversation now in terms of the work that's been done. I recognize each meeting that we have had to date, we post through your department the presentations. We post the notes and the questions that have come in, and we keep that running on the Glenview Maplehurst Boundary website page on the Halton District School Board. And I know this audience has been very attentive to following that and looking at the details. Can you tell us ultimately how the final decision is made in terms of which option we will be implementing for September 2023?
Absolutely. So I'll go over this more briefly now at the end of the presentation. But what we're going to do as next steps is, after this meeting, we're going to watch the feedback come in. So again, that's going to close next week, next Thursday. And once we've collated all that information and assessed it and reviewed it, and better understand not only some of the questions we're asking, but some of the qualitative data that's provided, we're going to create a package for our boundary review committee, which will then present at the February 13th boundary review committee meeting and the steering committee meeting. And it's at that point we're going to look at the feedback overall and see, based on this, are there certain options that we feel comfortable in advancing as preferred options, or a preferred option? It can be multiple or one, and those are presented to the Boundary Review Steering Committee. And the steering committee will review those and then present them to the director of education, as well as the senior staff, which will ultimately decide which option we would like to recommend to the board of trustees. And then we'll bring that forward to the board of trustees for consideration and approval at the March meetings. Note that after the director of education and the senior team has made the decision as to what to recommend to the board, we will provide a direct notification to the affected communities, so Glenview and Maplehurst, letting them know that the board report is available for review by them, and then that's typically the process. And then after the boundary is approved, then we also notify the community of the change, and that's what triggers the final step of this, which is the transition committee. Which falls outside of this scope, but then that's where we're starting to integrate students into their new future school facilities.
Thanks, Fred. And we do know that change is difficult for families in terms of moving from one school to the next school. And you have articulated that another whole group of folks take care of integrating new students, building a transition plan that starts well before September to make students feel comfortable leaving Glenview and moving into Maplehurst. What if I have a unique situation or an exception that I would like to appeal the decision to have my particular family move to Maplehurst? Is there any possibility of having that occur within our boundary review process?
So with regards to the standard boundary review process, I'd say in that situation there, like we've reviewed multiple options and trying to keep a lot of the North Aldershot or the rural areas in certain scenarios. There's a few of them that we considered, and they didn't make it through the shortlisted options. So I think in this process, it's outside of that. Again, like I mentioned earlier, there's the legacy exemption that we'll be considering for the more senior grades, whether or not your child falls under that. That said, after the process is completed, if there are extraneous situations where children or students need very specific needs, there is the option to do an out of catchment request or out transfer request. And that point, these schools will be closed to those. But if there is any situation where it requires further review, then those will be assessed by the superintendents to see, through an appeal and see if there's merit to grant that out of catchment request if there's an extraneous situation.
Okay, thank you very much for those pieces as well. It's difficult to look at various zones and determine why this zone and not that zone in terms of what is the final decision. Can you describe how this committee, what they looked at in terms of considering an area to move or creating a zone that this committee should consider?
So to start, when we began the process for our inaugural meeting, planning services did create zones based on major geographic areas or features such as major roads, creeks, parks, landforms, or things that would create separations between communities. And that's what we started with our initial zones, and each one of those zones have a particular number of students and a projection associated to it based on the existing number. So as we were going through the process, what we're looking at all the different criterias and things like walkability, transportation, long-term sustainable boundaries. And what we're having to do is balance all of those competing factors and seeing and combining these zones together, how well are we meeting all of these criteria. So a lot of the options that you'll see, and you can review a lot of all 13 that we have reviewed on the website and all the permutations is, there are different ways that you can combine them and look at them. And then it's always how we're reviewing them and how they meet those tests. It's not just the numbers, it's also some of the more qualitative factors that are grounded within the criteria I mentioned earlier, that we try to find the best solution possible. And when we're looking at further dividing the zones, that's where there's certain things that, were brought up either by the community or saying, can we separate development, or can we create a section that, it would kind of take a certain number of students so we can send them elsewhere and balance out the numbers. Those are other things that we looked at through the process of zone creation. And again, those decisions also need to be weighed against the criteria and how effective or how those meet the criteria overall. So it's it's balancing all of those factors together and looking at the sum of their parts.
Thank you very much, Fred. I'd like to talk about traffic, particularly in school areas. And we know that this has been a struggle for many schools across Halton, that as parents, we want schools where our children can walk to school and not have to rely on having parents drive. And we know we put a big push on healthy schools and walk to schools and those pieces. But there are some students who will live outside of the walkable area. How will the Halton Board accommodate for the increased traffic that perhaps an option might occur moving forward to Maplehurst?
So a lot of the options that we've developed, we tried to maintain where possible as much as we could the existing walk to boundaries. Those are established behaviors that we have with parents, and one of the things that we've definitely witnessed and we've gone through and experienced throughout the various jurisdictions of the board is, those are very hard behaviors to establish, especially walking to school, because there's a lot of concerns in and around the student safety and what barriers are being placed for students. So part of what we're looking at is always trying to match that neighborhood model as much as we can. So if you have an area that's walkable and they're accustomed to walking, you're already reducing, or you're not creating more strain on parent traffic. Where you are creating change, there is that risk, but we're always trying to find a way where we're limiting those boundaries or barriers. One thing that's beneficial about this boundary review is a number of the areas are already transported. So ideally, students are utilizing bus transportation to get to school. And before and after care, at least that's offset with the peak hours of the schools too. So really, these schools are, especially Maplehurst, which is the one that's going to be the recipient of a lot of students. They're built and they're designed for larger enrollments. So in part, they're somewhat designed to accommodate a lot of that. But Maplehurst is one that does have site constraints. So again, we'll be continuing to encourage walking to school where it's possible, taking the bus. If there is parent drop-offs, to do it on off-peak hours, or utilize other ways like walk-a-block or things like that. So that's a lot of communication that'll be coming out from both board level and school level, just to encourage parents to not all drive to school.
Okay, thank you very much for that as well. I know your team, for every area of Halton, looks at each school and the projections and the growth and the probabilities for the next 10 to 15 years, what will happen in our school. And so in bringing forth the need for this boundary review, it was evident that the development and the research that your team has done extensively over time has generated this boundary review. And given that, what might happen if we discover that we need both of these sites eventually, with the growth of Aldershot community as a whole, starts to really expand and grow at a faster rate? What is the possibility that we would be able to accommodate a future addition, or perhaps renovation, or building a new school in the area?
So that's part of the monitoring of enrollment projections and development yields. As mentioned earlier by our parent reps, that when we were doing our projections, we were definitely being a little bit more aggressive to expect the worst case scenario with the high density yields from apartment dwellings, because we're seeing that trend change with more family units. So what I'll say is that I think as the years go by, and to see what's going to happen beyond that 8-year period for another 10 years after that, I think that's where we're really going to see that big peak in enrollment if things continue the way they are. Now, is that going to warrant an addition or a new school? Really, it all depends on how much enrollment we're expecting over time. So with that is if we start seeing about 3 or 4 years ahead of when that peak enrollment or in the options we reviewed tonight, we're going to hit that max capacity, that there is a good business case to be made to build an addition or even look at a replacement school or a school within the intensification area. That's when we're going to have to start looking at options to submit to the Ministry of Education, which is the one that funds us these projects. The board doesn't fund it itself. They have to make requests to the Ministry of Ed for capital funding and to submit business cases for these priorities. And it's at that point we may see if there's an opportunity. But again, like I said, that's going to be a little bit closer to when we're arriving those peaks and when we start seeing that development materialize. If we see it happening sooner, then that'll give us the opportunity to make submissions earlier on. But we'll have to continue monitoring. And one thing I'd like to say very clearly is, I know this has been a thing that's been asked for for some time in this community, is that why don't we build an addition? We have portables, or we don't have enough space. When the ministry looks at it, they always look at it holistically, not just your school, but all the other schools in the surrounding community, to see how much space is available. And if you have space available to them, then they're looking at more of a boundary view. So really that's what we're going to have to assess in the future is, have we surpassed the overall accommodation space that we have available to us to warrant the addition of new pupil places, and make sure that they're not empty in 10, 15 years. So really it's all going to be contingent on where the numbers land and how the ministry funds it, and if they fund it.
Okay, thank you. And then on the question of development, we know that the rural areas are being developed at a slower pace than what was originally anticipated. Can the boundary for the rural areas be implemented at the time of construction of the North Aldershot development? In other words, why would we move the students in the rural area now?
So part of the option is, when we're looking at development, especially in the North Rural area, I think where this question is targeting, or where the question's targeting right now in Zone B, I believe, we don't anticipate that development happening within the forecast that we provide in these options. That's further out. We know that there's certainly infrastructure limitations there that have prevented that development from moving forward. So they're not part of the numbers. With that said, and just if I look at this generally speaking, when we're reviewing these options at the time of development, if that subdivision does proceed, that definitely changes things a little bit, because it is low density and we do get a number of additional yields. So from lower density development, we get a lot more students. So if that's what we're running into at that point in time, then that's new information. That's a new outcome. So we'll be looking at alternative solutions to that. But based on the options reviewed and the students that are in that area as of now, the options that we've had, they're too large of a population to leave at the existing school at present time without running into some of those capacity issues we were discussing earlier.
Great, Fred, and thank you very much for that explanation. And still on the theme of new builds and development, what does option 11EA consist of? And with a focus, does it include the new builds at the GO station?
I'll pass that one over. I will pass that one over to Michelle, just to confirm on the GO station development.
Thank you. Thank you, Michelle. If you could, being a key planner on this team, could you please address the question, what does option 11EA consist of? And with a focus, does it include the new builds at the GO station?
So option EA includes areas west of Cook Boulevard. So new development north of Masonry and east of Cook Boulevard will remain at Glenview. That's an EB. And EA, it's all new development. At this time, there are no students that are residing in EA.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. Maybe we can move down to some questions that have come in just now on options. So the first question is, option 11 is essentially a north/south divide with the exception of E. Can you please explain that for us?
Yep. So option 11 is kind of a continuation of one of the previous options we looked at, option 8, namely. And what it looks to do, and when we develop that option particularly, is try to keep as many of the walking areas within that 1.6 kilometer together. So we looked at the walking area, the established neighborhood, and where we would see the most established behavior to walk and roll to school. And then from there, we also received a lot of feedback in around what some of the other communities south of Plains Road that were already biking and walking to school, and that they were very much connected to that zone H. So zone G and H were very well connected together already. So that's how that south of Plains Road component came together, where it's that's a lot of the commentary we received, that that those are the established behaviors in those areas, and that they were contiguous. So you're not having to cross major barriers like plains roads and things like that on some of the ones that were outside of the walking area. And then zone F, in terms of its addition, it just so happens to be south of Plains Road, but a lot of that rationale was around the number of students that were projected in that area were a lot less than some of the other areas north of Plain. So in terms of trying to achieve that overall balance of enrollments, that was part of the considerations and how it all landed. And the other and then the other things that were also beneficial of that is it really pushed out the critical time as to when we need to take action at around 2030, which was helpful. And it did balance out the pressures at both schools quite effectively.
And thanks, Fred. I know that's the name of the game here, is that we do provide 2 viable, balanced schools for all the children in Aldershot, and that's the big picture that we're going for. If we could talk again, still on options. As I said, this group of observers have been amazing. They read your notes, they read the notes from the publications and the presentations from previous nights that we've been studying this with our parents. Can you please explain why option 8 was dismissed from consideration for tonight?
Yep. It kind of like I mentioned earlier on. So option 11 was a continuation of option 8, or an enhancement of it. So in option 8, the other thing that we did notice that made it not as effective as option 11 is that critical date as to when we would have to take action was a little bit sooner than what we would like. So I think that one we reached maximum portable capacity by about a year or two sooner than we did with option 11. It did have also the greatest impact of moving students comparatively to option 11 from Glenview to Maplehurst. So again, it was just a matter of balancing that out as well. And I believe, if I recall correctly, option 8 didn't divide zone E between, I think it was the entirety of zone E, inclusive of all the developments. So in this case here, what we've done with option 11 is further enhance that and say, okay, now we're going to split the pressures between both schools so that they're both taking on some of that pressure in Aldershot, and that also had the effect of reducing some of those critical dates down the road.
Thanks, Fred. And I suppose at the end of the day, we're looking at you're bound to 13 different options came forward. Probably could create another 3 or 4 as well. But the bottom line is that we're looking for a viable group of students to move together to transition to Maplehurst, while at the same time creating 2 viable schools in the Aldershot area. And so if people would like to review why certain options were not presented tonight and that they were eliminated, again, if you can please review the notes posted on the website, and you'll see the long-term accommodation numbers that should give you some answers as to that we were looking for a viable, healthy number of students to move together at Maplehurst, and at the same time look at this as a longevity piece, that for the next 7 to 10, maybe 13 years, that these schools would be balanced in terms of their growth. We've talked about transitions. I think that question came in, but we've talked about how both schools will be responsible, Glenview and Maplehurst, in helping to support the move of families and welcoming them well before September comes into place. And we do really care for ensuring that the resources have been allocated so that the mental health capacity of children and moving them forward with their peers and leaving some peers behind that will be there. And the details that we have for that is that they are team building and community activities, welcoming events, having groups of students come together to Maplehurst with their families, having open houses. And this really is a way that we would like to build a strong sense of belonging and making kids and their families feel very, very supported. And we have very strong administrators at both schools right now with phenomenal teaching teams that really work hard on that. Fred, but we'd like to go at this again. Are both sites, both of these schools, able to sustain a future development or addition? The question is, I believe that Maplehurst has already undergone additions. So really, is it realistic that they can sustain another one in terms of future growth?
Well, that's a fair question. Depending on the site, so that's an assessment that'll be done at a later time, because both schools, I'll say, have equal challenges in terms of how much they can accommodate, and they have site constraints as well. I'll say this, that depending on which school it is, we may be looking at a partial demolition and rebuild. Some of these schools are a little bit older. They have accessibility issues or limitations, or there's certainly room for improvement. So a lot of times when we're reviewing addition, it's not necessarily your traditional appendage to a school, especially with older facilities. There may be the opportunity, as an example, to remove a part of the school and make a more efficient footprint, so then you can go up a few stories as opposed to being on a single story. For an example, for Glenview or Maplehurst, you might look at it as, this wing of the building is rather old and needs too many updates, so it's better to just tear it down and build up more efficient classrooms. So when we get closer to and we look at the numbers, a lot of times before we submit business cases to the ministry, what we do is we do a feasibility study, and we work with architects to see what's the best way to maximize the capacity of a school and what solutions can we look at. So all of that will be thrown into the blender, and we'll figure out exactly what the best outcome would be. And if we run into situations where the enrollment is large enough, then that's where you might be talking about tear down and build to the right size that we need. Like it really all depends on how that growth over the long term materializes, and from there we'll probably making some later decisions.
Thank you very much, Fred, and for your entire team. I know they've been working hard at this to provide answers to the community for sure. And to our parents on this team, thank you very much for continuing to raise questions on your community's behalf. At this time, we are going to close the question period of time. We would encourage you, though, as viewers, to continue to provide the feedback to us, and you can continue to provide the questions. And on our website, we will try to post those for you so that you can have a clearer understanding on why the options were presented this evening. Fred, could I turn you then to explain the next steps in terms of gathering feedback?
Absolutely. Thanks, Jackie. So in terms of next steps, so the big one is the feedback portal. So this is where we're going to be collecting everyone's information, as well as your feedback on all three of the options. So the live stream that we presented tonight will be made available tomorrow. It'll be recorded and available online, so we'll post that. Afterwards, I would also encourage you to please fill out the feedback survey. Anybody that hasn't attended tonight, please relay this message to them as well, that they should fill out the feedback survey. And that has been open as of yesterday once we posted the preferred options. So we may see some people already submitting their requests, or sorry, their feedback to the board. This will be open until next Thursday, February 9th, and it'll close at noon. So we'll have quite a bit of time just to review everything, get a grasp of the options, and delve maybe even deeper into the numbers, which all of this is available on our board website. And then afterwards, our team is going to collate all this information, review it, and package it for our bound review committee. They'll also have full access to all the the raw data too, just so that they can see exactly what the comments were provided from the community. So again, please submit your feedback before next Thursday. Afterwards, on February 13th, the Boundary Review Committee will be meeting once again, and that's where they're going to be reviewing all of those, all the feedback. So staff will provide a presentation of, a summary of everything that was received at that point in time. And then afterwards, it'll be based on that feedback. We'll have a discussion around, the options themselves and which options that they would recommend to bring forward to the BRSC or the Boundary Review Steering Committee. So it can be one or it can be a few, whichever it is. Afterwards, the BRSC will then recommend one of those options to will bring forward those options to the Director of Education, and then that'll be reviewed by the director as well as the senior team, and they will select one of the options that's preferred, which will ultimately be presented to the Board of Trustees for consideration and later approval. And again, if you have any questions, we encourage you to just submit that to the mapleglenreview@hdsb.ca email. In terms of once it hits the board table, so it's going to be there, it'll be presented twice, first on March 1st and secondly on March 22nd. The first time we presented on March 1st is for information. We present to the Board of Trustees, and then we wait 2 weeks or 3 weeks in this case before rendering a final decision. And at both of those meetings, you may delegate to the board. So if you visit the standalone website, there'll be links to the delegation procedure if you wish to do that and speak to our Board of Trustees directly. In terms of our timelines here, so we've gone through the initial portion of our process. Like I said, the next meeting will be on February 13th. We'll be reviewing the information I just alluded to. Once that decision is made, again, we'll bring it to Administrative Council, which will review it, and afterwards we'll provide a notification to the community once the board report is going to be made public on the week of February 20th. So that typically it's on at noon on the Friday prior to the board meeting. And then the board meeting will be on March 1st, where we first present it, second one on March 22nd. Whatever the decision is, that will then be relayed to the community through school messenger after board approval. And then that's when the integration committee part kickstarts soon after that. So with that, I'll be handing it off to the local area trustee, Matthew, to bring us to a close this evening.
Yeah, thank you, Fred, Jackie, the parents on the BRC. You guys really haven't left me much to say other than I think the most important thing is to, kind of delineate the information that's been made available and continue to provide the feedback. As mentioned, that is until Thursday of next week, February 9th at 12 p.m. So if there's something that you really feel like you need to pass on to the BRC and the administrative team, this is the 11th hour to get it in for review and continual review. And the delegation process, I mean, that comes after the fact, but the feedback from the community, via emails and also the questions, I should say, from the BRC, they've been very good. And I can attest to the fact that they've done the research. Some of the questions they've come with and some of the different angles and views that I've seen them put forward to the administrative team have been very in-depth and very thoughtful. And they've really tried to do their best to represent the entire community based on, what they know, the families that they know in the community. It's not an easy job. So tip of the hat to all of you, because, I can only imagine, what it's like to go through this, being in the same school as well. So we appreciate all that you've done. And as well for the administrators, the amount of data that you guys have collected and how much you've put together in such a short time, week over week is quite incredible. And in a very digestible way that, all of us can review and try to make the best decisions for the community. And, with that, we want to remember that this is a community decision. We're looking at, all the families and students involved, and we may not all get what we want out of this, but I think, we're going to get what's best, for everyone in the long run. And, hopefully the transition's great. And, I know kids that go to both schools, and I can say that they're both great. So I think at the end of the day, even if it's a year from now, everyone will be happy. So outside of that, if there's any questions, concerns, feel free to email me as well, and I'll get back to you as soon as I can with anything that I can do, anything I can help with. If there's something that's not clear, or maybe if there's something you feel like you're not getting from another resource. So thanks. And I think I pass it back to Jackie now, if I'm not mistaken.
Thank you very much, Matthew. Really appreciate that. A huge thanks to Fred and his team and everybody for taking the time to care about the Aldershot community and to really make a difference in the lives of children and developing two very viable schools to represent the future. So thank you with that and have a good evening.